nab that deer later today. It looks like we're now live. Just want to confirm the YouTube feed is on. Yeah, okay. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final meeting of the Tax Expenditure Review Working Group. My name is Nate Luby. I proudly represent all of the people of Lewiston in the Maine State Senate, and I serve as the working group's co-chair. We'll continue with introductions of our members and brief introductions of our staff, and we'll begin with Representative Terry.
Good morning. Thank you for waiting for me. I appreciate it. I'm Representative Mo Terry. I serve the people of District 26 in Gorham, and I serve as co-chair.
Thank you, Representative. Next up, Representative Millett.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Someone Millett, representing House District 71, the citizens of Norway, Sweden, Waterford, and West Paris.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Kryzak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Ted Kryzak. I represent District 20, Acton, Lebanon, and part of Shapley.
Thank you. And Senator Pouliot.
Morning, State Senator Matt Pouliot. I represent Senate District 15, the towns of Augusta, China, Oakland, Sydney, and Vassarboro.
Thank you. And we are joined by our very capable staff this morning. Julie Jones, who serves as an analyst for the Tax Committee and works in the Office of Fiscal and Program Review. Lucia Nixon, who's Director of the Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability. Carrie Hojara, who's an analyst in OPEGA, as well as Sabrina Carey, who's Executive Assistant for OPEGA. Our meeting is being broadcast on YouTube as well as on the legislature's audio stream. So just as a reminder, if you have to duck out for a moment, please make sure you are on mute when you're doing that. As I mentioned, this is our final meeting of the working group. And I think our primary goal today is to review the materials that the staff have prepared that I think did a good job of capturing the substance of our discussion and our recommendations from the last several meetings. And so what I would propose for this morning is that we work through those documents, make sure they line up with our expectations for what we're hoping to achieve with this working group. And I feel like I've said this at every meeting. I'm very much appreciative of everyone's efforts here. It feels like we are building consensus around some positive changes. And so if we can come out of today's meeting with a unanimous consensus recommendation for how to make adjustments and improvements to this process, I feel we will have accomplished our task and done a very good job of it. So before we start with any of the documents, are there any comments or questions from members before we get started? Seeing none. I think the first document we'd like to take a look at is the Tax Expenditure Review Working Group Draft Recommendations Table. That's a Word document that was emailed out yesterday. I believe Carrie is ready to share that document on our screen as well to help facilitate the conversation. So Carrie, whenever you're ready.
All right, can everybody see the document now? And good morning.
Good morning. Could you zoom in one or two clicks?
Yes, I can. Let's see. How's that?
That's great.
Okay. To begin, so we grouped the recommendations topically. Hopefully they capture what the working group discussed in the last meeting. But we're, I think, looking for clarity and to make sure that we have captured those recommendations correctly. The first group of recommendations deal with the expedited review process, and you can also refer to the draft that we provided for more details, and that would be on pages 7 and 8. So recommendation 1 would be to continue the 6-year cycle for expedited review conducted by the Taxation Committee using information available from MRS's Red Book and OPEGA's annual process and information to update the categorization of new expenditures. I guess
Sure,
we're
maybe-
looking, go ahead.
Maybe we'll just give a pause after we go through each section, and if members have a question or comment, you're welcome to raise your hand and chime in. And if we've got no questions or comments, we'll assume that's the consensus of the group and move on to the next one. So any questions or comments on this item? Representative Kryzak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this the point where we should talk about having MRS do several years in the Red Book, not, the information. Right now, they give the current year and the next year, but then they give several years back in the budget part. So I'd like to see it in the front of the book, as opposed to having to look through the budget to find it.
Right, that's a great point. If you'd like, we can instead throw out what I just said, and we can talk about all the recommendations within a topic area. The point that Representative Kryzak raised is, I believe, is contained in number 3.
Oh, okay. That's why I asked if this was the point to ask. I saw the Red Book, so I didn't know if this was a proper time.
So with leave of the committee, we'll scrap what I said just a moment ago, and we'll go through a topic area, and then we can have discussion questions. So Carrie, go right ahead with number 2 and 3.
Sure. The second recommendation in the expedited review process grouping is that statute would be amended to repeal the requirement for OPEGA to provide information to facilitate the tax committee's annual expedited review. And number 3 would require targeted enhancements to the Red Book to facilitate the expedited reviews. And it would include 6 years of foregone revenue for tax expenditures, 4 years of history, and 2 years of projections. And also include the take-up rate for certain tax expenditures listed there.
Thank you, Carrie. So we had discussion with MRS, and they seem willing to include the 6 years. So I think we should include it in recommendation. I don't think it hurts to put it in statute as well, because we know that over time, sometimes there's staff turnover and those sorts of things. So this would help ensure that piece continues. The question I had for this group is, we had some very helpful testimony regarding the so-called take-up rate for certain tax expenditures. Chairs discussed this with staff, and we felt that these 3 credits, and maybe also the sales tax fairness credit, we might add that one to the group. We were trying to capture what the public testimony was suggesting, and that these tax credits targeted to working people, low to moderate income families, having a sense of the take-up rate might be an important piece of data for the policymakers. Any comments on that, or additional credits we should maybe suggest?
Would that including but not limited language, Senator, exclude the larger economic development tax expenditure categories?
That's a great question. I was interpreting the public comments to be asking us to focus on these individual family tax benefits as opposed to the broader economic development benefits. I think if we were to task MRS with coming up with the take rate for every tax expenditure, that's probably an enormous task.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I apologize for jumping in there. I will note that in the Red Book, currently, there is a number in some of those economic development programs that says how many people are how many companies are using those credits already. So we may sort of have an idea of that currently. I don't know that the take-up rate for low to moderate income families is in the Red Book at this point. I don't think that it is. So I think we sort of already have a vehicle for that business expense, or business, businesses taking advantage of those.
We might suggest adding the word estimate to this bullet. I think policymakers are looking for a sense of what MRS feels is the take rate, maybe not a precise exact number of filers.
Where would you insert that word estimated? In front of tax take-up rate or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that would work.
I raised the question, Senator. I'm comfortable with that insertion and yours and Representative Terry's comments.
Great, thank you, Representative. Julie, followed by Lucia.
Yes, the way the item is listed in item 3 on the chart, it talks about including, and I guess we'd say the estimated take-up rate for certain tax expenditures, including but not limited to. If we are going to put something into the statute, we would need to either specify the credits that it would apply to, or indicate who would be making the decision as to which others. If you're saying including but not limited to, it's saying it could include others, but we need to know who was going to make that decision, whether Maine Revenue Services would decide or whether it should be based upon recommendations from the tax committee or the government oversight committee or whatever new entity you might create by the time you get to the end of the chart here. It's just something to think about. Oh, and the Red Book does include some information about estimated, well, I don't know whether it's estimated, but under the sales tax fairness credit, it lists a number of taxpayers affected as 197,000. I assume that's an estimate rather than an indication of how many people have actually claimed it, but I'm not sure.
Thank you, Julie. We'll give some thought to those questions. We'll go to Lucia, and then we'll go back to the working group.
Thank you, Senator Libby. The point I was just going to say is that if some language could be added to connect this to the issue that you're speaking to, as around programs or credits that are geared towards low-income populations or geared towards, it seems like if it's part of the economic security of low-income people, if this is what it's getting at, maybe adding something to that effect at least in the report, if not in the statute, just sort of narrow the scope.
So I think if we accepted that friendly amendment and included some language to that effect, and then gave Maine Revenue Services the ability to decide beyond the delineated tax credits that we talk about, the fairness credits, earned income credit, educational opportunity credit, we say that it's including, and we want estimated take-up rate for those. At least Maine Revenue Service can add additional ones that fit into the category as Lucia described it. That might be a solution. I guess I would also note that any kind of statutory changes are going to be put into a bill and heard by a committee, worked by a committee. So if we don't get it perfect today, there are obviously other opportunities to get it right.
For the chairs, if I might, are you looking for motions on these topical areas to give staff the authority to move forward with drafting, or just general consensus? I'm willing to offer a motion on the discussions on topics 1, 2, and 3 as discussed for drafting purposes, if you're ready for that, or we can take them one at a time. Okay.
Thank you, Representative. For staff, do you feel we need motions for this? It feels like we're heading towards, or we're working towards consensus, so we could do one motion at the end, if that works. And I guess I'd also ask the committee. Julie, followed by Julie.
I was just going to suggest that I think it would be helpful if you, it's sort of interrupting things a little bit perhaps, or maybe not, maybe it's a quick answer. What the process of the working group will be after this meeting with regard to the report. So we're going to have to be making changes and updating some things in the draft that you received in the email yesterday. This is your last meeting, so we can't bring it back to a future meeting for you to review and go, yep, that's okay. But you're going to want to review it. So I'm guessing, we'll put something together based upon your decisions today and we'll send it out to you. What usually happens is something like members review it, and what I would suggest is if there are any suggested changes or anything that a member feels that we got wrong in putting the draft together, that they get in touch with the chairs and the chairs moderate for staff what changes we should make in a draft. If staff is getting a direction from an individual working group member that they want something changed or think something ought to be changed, we're not always in a position to know whether that should be done or not. It really needs to go to the whole group. So if you sort of go through the chairs, then they can moderate whether we need to ask everybody or whether they feel that they can make a decision with regard to that. But just in terms of whether that's the way I've envisioned this process, the report is due December 1st. So essentially probably between now and December 1st that we be engaged in that process of maybe nobody will have any suggestions. Maybe we'll do a perfect job, but I'm not aware that that has ever happened. So it would be a precedent.
I'm always open to set a precedent, so we'll see. Lucia.
I would concur with Julie about that's also my experience typically with study group reports. So I just want to echo that. And then on the question about the motions, I think if you're working towards a consensus and you keep going through and you want to take, we're happy to do it if you want to take one vote at the end and note any exceptions if there isn't a consensus on something, or do it in these topical blocks, whatever works best for the committee.
Okay, appreciate that. So maybe just to be super clear and explicit, we can take votes on sections as Representative Millett suggested. That way, if we get to the end, we know where folks are at. And then the other suggestion is that once we're done our work today, staff will work on a draft, and that the chairs may serve as a moderator role if there are substantive requests for changes from an individual member. Otherwise, we'll treat that process as kind of a review of the work that staff has done, and if there's a word that needs to be tweaked that's not substantive in nature, we can allow that to go. But if there's a wholesale change to a recommendation, the chairs may need to moderate that. So I put two suggestions out on the floor, quick roll call votes on sections, and staff chairs helping to moderate any changes to the report after we finish our meeting today. Does that make sense to folks?
Yes.
Okay. So Representative Millett, you have a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that the working group approve the topics 1, 2, and 3 under the heading of expedited review process as stated in 1 and 2, and with the editorial comments that have been proposed in number 3.
Thank you, Representative. Is there a second?
I second it.
Okay, seconded by Representative Terry, I guess. Questions or comments? Julie.
I've just received an email from Mike Allen at Maine Revenue Services. I guess they didn't receive attendee links to this particular meeting, but he has indicated that they have significant concern about estimating take-up rates. I don't know if you want to hear from them about that, but I wanted to let you know.
We did have some communication with MRS. I don't know whose side didn't close the loop, but regardless, if staff want to send them a panelist link, we'd welcome their input. Representative Terry, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that these are our recommendations, as you had stated earlier, Senator, that this will be put in bill draft. This will be a bill that will get tossed to the legislature within the next, I would imagine, soon-ish. And I think at that point, that's where we'll come up with the tweaks for things like take-up rates and probably almost anything else that we come up with as changes go by.
Well said. So, is there interest from the working group in hearing from Maine Revenue Services on number 3? If there is, we can pause for a moment while they join. Representative Terry, do you have a suggestion?
It would be worthwhile to hear from them if they're able to come online and comment.
Very good.
Can we hold the vote until we hear from them and move on to the next section while we're waiting?
Yeah, sure. That's a good idea, Representative.
Looks like Dr. Allen is in the attendee. Oh, moving over.
Dr. Allen, good morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you. That transition from YouTube to the panelist slowed me down a little bit. We just have that's a lot of work, and we did quite a bit of work when we had created those estimates of take-up rates for the study that was done a couple of years ago. I believe it was for the property tax fairness credit at that point. I mean, I know for the credit for educational opportunity, we're struggling to really get a feel for just what the cost of that program is and the number of people that are taxpayers that are going to take advantage of that credit, never mind sort of the pool of people that could potentially do that. We have a report that's due to you in February on the educational opportunity tax credit. We've have a contract with a outside researcher that's looking at that, but there just isn't a lot of data, and so on that issue, and so I don't know how successful we're going to be in getting you even an estimate of the take-up rate for the educational opportunity tax credit. I mean, as you can see from the Red Book, that's a lot of work that we put in over the summer and fall to put that Red Book together. To now add another layer to it is going to add to that workload at a time that we also are putting a lot of resource into the Revenue Forecasting Committee. We have a December 1st report date. And the report that goes out next December 1st is the big revenue forecast, because that's the basis of the governor's budget submission. So I'm just hesitant to take on more at a time when we're understaffed, and it already takes up quite a bit of our resource at a very busy time to put the Red Book out. I mean, it may be from, I mean, if there's an issue on certain items, I mean, maybe from time to time we can, as a request from the legislature, take a look at these like we did a couple of years ago. But it is a bigger job than one might think.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. So what do members think on this item? Representative Terry?
I'll just say repeat. As this will get put into bill form, I think this is something that will have a little time to sort of percolate over the next few months, to think about if there is a way to do this more efficiently. And if it's one of those things where there's just no way that it will happen, I think that that will get worked out in the bill process. I think for now, as these are just our recommendations, I personally would like to keep it in there, see how it pans out over a little bit of time. And of course, if it doesn't work out, then when it comes down to the statute being written or rewritten, that is, that will not be in there. So, but I think that we owe it to the public to give it a shot.
Thank you, Representative Terry. Folks okay with that recommendation from Representative Terry? Any objection? So we're going to keep it in the recommendations, and then the bill process will be the opportunity to dig into this a bit more and either refine it or trash it. Hearing no objection, I think that's consensus. All right. So Carrie, let's move on to the full evaluation process. I'm not sure if we should go one by one or try to take up the whole group. It looks like we've got two here. So let's review 4 and 5, and then the group can have discussion.
On the full evaluation process, the two recommendations are the first to, well, when establishing the prioritized schedule, which is the order in which to take the full evaluations, prioritization should be given to business incentive tax expenditures over tax expenditures that are directed primarily to individual tax relief. The process should also take statutory sunset dates into consideration in an attempt to complete evaluations in time for consideration by the legislature in advance of the sunset. And additionally, a third bullet, consideration should be given to options to better incorporate the taxation committee in the annual review of updates to the categorization and schedule of future full evaluations. And it looks like we were looking for some input on exactly what the working group was envisioning there. And which should I also give the next recommendation so you can take them together. Recommendation 5 was that the working group recommended that the OPEGA director, in consultation with the GOC and tax, review the current statutes governing the full evaluation process and identify potential changes to the statutory framework and language to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of the full evaluation process going forward, with attention given to the evaluation parameters, which is the what OPEGA is doing within the evaluation, and then also the schedule and pace of the full evaluation reports.
Thank you, Carrie. So on number 4, I think the staff are looking for input on the third bullet in number 4. Consider better options to incorporate tax committee in the annual review of updates to the categorization and schedule for future evaluations. So one idea that bubbled up in the last week or so was if we require that the GOC include 2 members of the tax committee every single legislature, that simple change alone to me might have some significant impact on the way information flows between the 2 bodies and could help in real-time sort of coordination of decision making. I sort of think that's a simple and elegant solution rather than creating a whole new set of report dates and joint meetings and sharing of reports and input and that kind of thing. That was one idea that came up this week that might be a nice way to solve that. So I just want to throw that out there for the group's consideration.
So as I hear you, Senator, you would be recommending that the GOC appointments at the beginning of each regular session, first regular would include 2 members of taxation on the GOC?
That's correct, Representative. And, we could even have it, be written so that it's one representative is from the majority party and one representative is from the party that has the second highest number. That way there's some political balance.
Since I'm the only one on the meeting right now that's not a member of the taxation committee or has been, I guess I want to defer to them. It makes sense to me, thinking about it, but I'm not sure, or I'm not privy to the workload and whether that would be a divisive proposal for the committee members themselves.
Representative Terry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Millet, I was married to the idea of an entire subcommittee for this group. That being said, one of the reasons that I wanted that so much is because I feel like the tax committee doesn't have sort of skin in the game for the tax expenditure review process. We see it at the end, generally speaking, in the very beginning and at the end of every report. So we really just don't have the skin in the game. We're not there for the process, and we're not required to be there for the process. I think this is a great solution for being required to be part of the process. I've sat in on a few over the years GOC meetings when it comes down to these reports being finished, and almost always I have more questions than answers, or even just being part of it, the questions are always coming up. So I think having one of us there, somebody from the taxation committee there every time, will be able to not only give our input, but also be able to report back to the taxation committee very timely. It can be a part of our regularly scheduled meetings. So I'm in great favor of it, and for sure having members of the majority and the minority in there as well, I think is super important.
Thank you, Representative Terry. Julie, followed by Representative Kryzak.
It's sort of part of my job. I see ambiguity everywhere. Is this, it may be clear, but is the suggestion that the 2 members from tax be 2 of the current 10, or would they be 2 additional positions? So the Government Oversight Committee would go to 12 members rather than 10.
Oh,
I think we have 12 GOC members at present. And I think rather than grow the GOC, we would just keep it at the same number and require the presiding officers to appoint at least 2 members from tax to GOC.
Thank you.
Representative Kryzak.
yeah, I have to agree with Madam Chair. I think this would be a lot simpler than forming a new group or a new committee. Just having 2 of us from the tax committee to come to your meetings would be a lot better for us, I think.
Thank you, Representative. I'll offer that by happenstance, I've sort of served in this role during this legislature, and I've observed that during tax hearings, members will ask me questions about where things sit, and I appreciate that I've hopefully developed some trust and rapport in being able to report out honestly what's going on. But I think an improvement on that might be having 2 members, one from each party, so that all members feel comfortable they have an effective go-between with the GOC. So. Okay, so it sounds like we've got consensus on number 4 and recommending appointment of 2 tax members to GOC. Number 5, they're seeking some input on that section. And Lucia, I believe you drafted yesterday, I know it was late in the day, some suggested changes. Is this the point where maybe we're calling you to talk that through? Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so this, I've started to, seeing this recommendation, I started to put some thought into it. I think one of the recurring themes that I've heard from the GOC in particular and through this working group is interest in the pace of the evaluations and making sure we complete, and I'm speaking now to the full evaluations and some of the things we sort of recently piloted to try and turn them around in a way that it's more better meets the needs of the legislature. And the tension is really between the level of detail and prescriptive language in the statute, some of which is permissive, but it gives a really wide range of things to look at, which sort of sets the expectation. And I think in thinking about, I've been starting to think of ways that perhaps we could streamline that, make sure still the key elements of each of the evaluation are still addressed. And so I've started to work on potentially some draft language to keep the substance there, but perhaps make it a little bit more streamlined. And this would be a way to balance, I think, give OPEGA a little bit more flexibility and the GOC to keep the pace at sort of what we've been recently trying to do and had the fortune of having a little extra resources to do so. I don't know. So anyway, I've started to work on some draft language to that effect that
Thank you, Lucia. So I've been talking with the staff at OPEGA for a year about this type of effort. And if I were to sum up the draft that I looked at, it's really tweaks to language that allow more flexibility to adapt the evaluation parameters to data that's available, to ensure that if a credit, for example, is, directed to targeted populations, that the language allows OPEGA to review that, as opposed to maybe digging into individual beneficiaries. That's one example. I think when this got off the ground, OPEGA was directed to explore every evaluation parameter as far as they could go, no matter how long it might take staff to complete that work. And the result was an exceptionally detailed work product that may take a long time to complete. And so I think what we've felt over the few years is maybe we need to give OPEGA a bit more flexibility so that staff can decide, which areas require a deep dive and which areas might just require less of a deep dive evaluation. So I guess what I'd recommend is we give Lucia and the staff some time to continue to refine those adjustments, and that we can consider it through the report editing process. And that, as Representative Terry noted in an earlier section, if we suggest language to this effect, it's going to go through a tax public hearing. So that'll be the opportunity to make significant changes if tax wants. So I think that's my recommendation here, is that we sort of direct Lucia and the staff to continue making some adjustments to statute here. I believe she'd be willing to share what she's written with the group, and we sort of let them do that work, and we'll note in the report that OPEGA is working on some of those changes. Questions or comments?
Mr. Chair, I would comment only in that I detected lack of enthusiasm for limiting the full reviews to 1 per year. But based on the information that there are 32 that qualify, and on a 6-year review, I would be concerned about the workload for not only the OPEGA staff, but tax committee people and those organizations, MRS and other administering groups, to do 5 or more per year. So I'm hoping that the language that you have looked at and that Lucia's working on would tend to conclude that we're not expecting all 32 to be reviewed in a full review context every 6 years. Am I comfortable in that conclusion?
I think so, Representative. I think when we established this process 6 years ago, we said full reviews will be completed on a 6-year cycle. A few years into that, the legislature said we're going to repeal that hard deadline altogether, and it's going to take as much time as it takes. And now version 3 is, I could sum up as, we're going to give OPEGA the flexibility to get these reports done more quickly, but we are not going to prescribe how many in a year. We're not going to prescribe when they're due. We're just going to make it easier for the staff to lead a project to a more efficient completion, letting them use discretion. And I want to ask Lucia if I've summed that up fairly.
Sure. Yes, that's my understanding as well, that there would not be any prescribed schedule, but there would be flexibility to proceed as efficiently as possible within the resources available. And I did just want to sort of quickly run through what would be the elements that would be in the sort of revised parameters in terms of what an evaluation would consider looking at depending on what was available. And that would be the fiscal impact to the state, the design and implementation of the tax expenditure, which may include looking at best practices, the overall impact in terms of achieving broad policy purposes and goals, the achievement of specific measurable outcomes, the relationship to other relevant policies and programs, perhaps looking at other states, potentially looking at cost effectiveness. Again, that's a big data question if we have what we need, and then looking at opportunities for improvement. So I think it covers all the big points in just a more succinct way and provides a little flexibility without prescribing specifically how and what details of those OPEGA would look at.
Lucia, would you be willing to share do you want to walk through the language now on screen, or do you want to email it to the group, or do you want more time to refine it? What's your plan?
I'm happy to share it on the screen. It's kind of messy, but I'm happy to share it if that would be helpful. I defer to whatever's whatever the committee wishes.
Right. It is a little messy because there's strikes in addition. So it's really the preference of the group. I think Lucia's captured the flavor of the language. If that's adequate for the group, we can move on to the next section.
I think it's adequate. I think messy is an accurate term as well. A little hard to read on the screen. Easy, not as hard when you print it out. I would suggest printing it out and looking through it. But I would say I think they were okay to move on if everybody's okay with that.
I can also work on a clean version that shows what it would look like if it was amended as such. So
I don't want to put you on the spot too badly, Lucia.
So
Republicans might have a different interpretation of the word messy than Democrats generally. However, I was comfortable with what I heard Lucia saying. My only question to you, other members, is in the language leading up to the 2 bullets, it talks about changes to the statutory framework / language. Would we be endorsing specific language changes in statute, or would we be simply endorsing the content of this item 5 without the messy language being included?
That's a great question, Representative. I would answer it as if the working group is comfortable with the framework that Lucia has made out, I would suggest we see if we can support that general framework, and that the specific language changes that Lucia has been drafting and is in a first draft stage, that we sort of take on good faith that we'll support those recommendations as part of our report, and that the tax committee ultimately is going to have final say and is going to vet this carefully. So I think that would be my suggestion.
And I agree with that as well.
Folks okay with that approach? Yep. Okay. Great. Number 6.
Number 6 falls into the area of preparing existing tax expenditures for future evaluations. So that group of expenditures that are currently slated for a full review but have not been reviewed yet. The working group has made, or this is the language now, recommends a legislative review of existing statutes governing the tax expenditures classified for full evaluation to identify where amendments are needed to ensure that the expenditures are ready for evaluation. So we note in this table that different mechanisms for implementing this recommendation are something for the group to work out, and that's a different table. So I didn't know if you wanted to bracket that for now and focus on whether this recommendation is something you want to make or take those together.
Thank you, Carrie. So this is the area where we know tax expenditures are coming up for review, but the current statute doesn't give OPEGA quite the sort of direction on evaluation parameters. There may be potentially other changes that would want to be considered. And so who's going to do this work is the question. I think at our last meeting, the subcommittee was sort of the dumping ground of when a work project was coming up, we'd say, well, the subcommittee can do it. I don't know if I or members were actually thinking about serving on this committee, but it was going to be quite a bear. So, one idea is that this idea could be vetted by tax committee in the second regular session, and a summer working group might be established to spend time with the big tax expenditures that are coming up for review and making decisions on evaluation parameters among other changes. So that's one idea of how that might be tackled. Welcome any other thoughts or suggestions.
Senator, that sounds reasonable to me. We'll be talking about the subcommittee later in this chart, I assume, so we can come back and fine tune that if needed then.
Yep, I think that's a good suggestion. Karen? I
was just going to ask if you wanted me to scroll to the other table, but it sounds like perhaps we'll wait on that.
I think that sounds good. I want to welcome Representative Stover and give her an opportunity to introduce herself to the group. Her screen may be frozen. Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to that. Everyone okay moving on to number 7? Okay. Sorry, I'm without my mouse, so my scrolling is slow. Number 7 is in the topic area of ensuring that any newly enacted or amended expenditures are set up to be evaluated. So the current language of the recommendation is that a legislative process should be established to ensure that legislation to establish or amend a tax expenditure contains provisions to facilitate the subsequent review of those tax expenditures. And this is another one where the options for how this might be implemented are something for the group to figure out as we move along. Thank you, Kara. This is closely tied to number 6, so maybe we'll just pause on this one for now and come back to it. So go ahead to number 8. Number 8 refers to what the group, I think, in the last meeting was
calling super quick or super fast, rapid reviews for OPEGA. And we're now using the language of limited analysis projects. The current language for that recommendation is that the tax committee would be authorized to request 2 tax expenditure limited analysis projects per year to be completed by OPEGA based on existing data and information to provide additional research and analytical support to taxation as they consider tax expenditure legislation.
Thank you, Carrie. So as a tax committee member, I think I can speak for the group and say there have been times during a legislative session where we've been really interested in getting OPEGA's initial thoughts on a bill that's before the committee. And so having a super quick option that can be used up to 2 times a year made sense to me. And it sounds like OPEGA might be able to support that work. And I think the idea is in a limited analysis project, they are gathering data that's easily obtainable elsewhere. That may not include intensive survey work among Maine taxpayers per se, but it may include taking a look at what other states have for similar programs. And if those states have done an evaluation, is there anything that might be of value to the Maine legislature in deciding whether to enact or substantially amend a tax expenditure? So that's the idea that we were talking through in the last week. And I looked to Representative Kryzak, Representative Terry, Senator Pouliot in particular to see if this would be useful from a tax committee perspective.
Representative Kryzak.
Sorry.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it would have been very helpful this year. We had a couple that came in that if we had gotten just a little more information after going through public hearings and having work sessions, and if OPEGA had come in and they were working on reports already, so everything was pushed off until they finished the reports. If they had just been able to come in and give us enough information that we could have voted on those issues then. I didn't see anything like that in the 129th, but in the 130th, there was several. So if we could just call up OPEGA and say, what do you know now? And then we could actually vote on the bill and put it on the floor. It would really speed up and if we're only doing 2 a year, like I said, I don't remember any in the 129th. So I think we had 2 in the 130th.
Well said. Representative Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to sort of give a little background in the sort of the thinking behind this as well. We get in possession of the Red Book in the beginning of the first regular session, somewhere mid-February, and by then we also know what our a fairly good idea of what our bill load looks like. So the thought is somewhere in between, somewhere around that time, we can request these reports so we can get our work done based on what our work for the year is. I personally am in big favor of this one. I think it would be incredibly helpful for us for our work on the tax committee. But just wanted to sort of give everybody a good idea of where that comes from.
Thank you, Representative. Lucia.
I just wanted to say that this is definitely something that OPEGA is willing to take on. It just within our existing, this brings up the question of staff resources that during session with our other projects going on, this would be outside what we're normally doing. So we'll get back to that, but I just wanted to flag that.
Thank you, Lucia. I think that's going to be a theme coming up here about OPEGA's resources, given that it's a very, very small office, that this would be new work and we may need to consider recommending and funding an additional position, at least to accommodate some of these requests. I think I hope we could all agree that if we say we're going to task OPEGA with 3 new activities, that we are not then going to deny them the extra staff to carry them out. So they kind of go together. If we can't get the staff funding approved, then we're not going to be able to adopt some of those labor-intensive OPEGA tasks. Representative Kryzak. Sorry, Representative Kryzak, did you have a question?
I'm sorry, I forgot to take myself off a mute. I was just wondering, are all the positions in OPEGA filled right now? Do they have openings?
Lucia?
We do have one opening right now. A person just recently left. We're filling that as soon as we can and struggling to keep up in the meantime. But that is a position that is in the current thing. We just got vacated and we're filling it quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Pulliam.
So you've all been making great points this morning. I will just say that I concur. I do think it would be helpful to have this analysis so that we can make decisions, more quickly. It's frustrating to carry over bills to the next session when we might be able to otherwise take action if we had just a little bit more information.
Thank you, Senator. One additional point on this concept is, we would allow tax to request up to 2. Kind of a hiccup there is that GOC by statute is directing the work of OPEGA. So what we're thinking is it would be a request from tax to GOC. GOC would give a yay or nay. I'm expecting with 2 members of tax now serving on GOC that would be a perfunctory process, but it would provide a relief valve in the event that OPEGA is really challenged to keep up with the tasks they've been assigned. But I'd expect GOC says, yes, go ahead and engage in this limited analysis project for tax. And then the second piece is that once that authorization is given, OPEGA does what they can in a 30-day period and then returns that work product, however complete it may be, understanding it's not a full analysis, it's not a full review, it's just what they've been able to gather in a short period of time. And those would be sort of the parameters for how we might make this thing work and be useful to the Tax Policy Committee. By head nods, it looks like we have consensus on this one. And of course, I'm sharing and looking at the text chat here and text on the phone and the documents. So I've missed a couple things. I think I've missed us taking votes on some of our prior items. So Representative Millett, if you have a motion on number 8, I think that'd be in order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that the working group endorse the recommendation in item or topic number 8 in the area of limited analysis projects as proposed.
I
Thank you.
second.
Seconded by Representative Kryzak. Further discussion or questions? All in favor? Unanimous of those present. Representative Stover, good morning. Thank you for joining us. It looks like you might have some broadband challenges.
Good morning. I'm having.
For the members of the public, Representative Stover has joined us. She's having some internet broadband challenges, but we welcome her to the working group this morning. Okay.
continue.
Okay. Uh, We've all been there.
What did she say?
We've all been there. If we could go back and bring up number 4 and 5 on the screen, I don't believe we took a vote on that one. Representative Terry?
I make a motion that we accept numbers 4 and 5 in the full evaluation process. Going back to the little tweaks that we discussed where OPEGA was looking for input.
Great, thank you. Is there a second?
Second?
Second by Representative Millet. Further discussion or questions? Seeing none, all in favor? It's unanimous of those present.
Aye.
So 6 and 7, we're going to set aside for the moment, and we will move on to, I believe, number 9, 10, and 11.
9, 10, and 11 pertain to data, and the full text for these at present is on page 11 of the draft, if anybody is interested in that. Number 9 is a recommendation that steps are taken to ensure that OPEGA can access relevant and necessary data for tax expenditure evaluations. Part of that process would be examining best practices in other states regarding data sharing between evaluation offices and state tax agencies and program administrators, and that relevant proposals for improvements in Maine would be developed. I think we are looking for input on who precisely might be doing that work, and also mentioning a memo did come from Pew that might be relevant to this topic. I think Lucia might have that available to share. Should I move on to 10 and 11 first and then take them together?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and just run through 10 and 11?
Sure. 10 would be a recommendation to develop standardized processes and formats for tax expenditure data collection and reporting by administering agencies. And 11 would be to ensure that existing and new statutes governing tax expenditures include provisions for data collection, which might be accomplished by the recommendation 6 and 7 above. But for 9 and 10, this is again a place where the Pew memo might be relevant, and there might be a need for input about who would do the work.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. Representative Kryzak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a real concern here. I'm just wondering, what kind of data are you looking for that you're not getting? I understand that in the past, you've been doing memorandums of understanding in order to get information from MRS. Are you looking for information that's on individuals' tax returns?
Maybe Lucia can answer.
Sure. I think what we're looking for is not, what we're looking for here is to learn from other states and improve any options that maybe are available options for improvement to streamline data sharing, not to access data that we're not allowed to access, certainly. It's that within the constraints of the confidentiality requirements of taxpayer information, but just that we have become aware that there are many states that are doing this similar type of work, and some of them have done a lot of work around working with their state tax agencies and other agencies, executive branch agencies that administer tax incentives, to develop some pretty streamlined and effective processes and protocols to ensure to make that data sharing as efficient and effective as possible.
Okay, so you're not asking us to open up individual tax returns or business tax returns to get information off of those. And is it better that we come up with some kind of way that anytime any new tax expenditure comes in and it's part of the legislation is what data has to be collected. So it's already done ahead of time. Would that be better than, just saying, okay, you need to collect more data? I think if we specify exactly what you're looking for and what you need, and it has to be part of any legislation in the future.
So
I have a concern that if we're collecting information that, because we were talking about having computers and all that other stuff during some of the meetings, to have the data switch from MRS to Opega. I just want to make sure that we're not talking about anything that's on a tax return that's not allowed to be given to you now. I'm hoping we're not opening any doors that you can get other information that in my mind, I don't need to know that on the tax committee to make a decision on something. I just need to know whether a tax expenditure is working or not.
So this recommendation is not at all expanding the type of data that we're currently authorized under statute to obtain. This is about the processes and systems that work together to make the data come to Opega as it is needed for evaluation. Sometimes to answer the evaluations questions that we're asked to answer by the statute and by the GOC and tax, we do need to look. It's very helpful to look not at individually identifiable, but to look at disaggregated data as stripped of identifying information. So there are instances but that's all set forth already in statute, what we have access to. And we're not looking at all, this recommendation, as I understood it, was not at all about expanding what Opega had access to. That wasn't something we were hearing from the working group. What we were hearing was that there's evidence to be gained from the other 30 plus states that do this type of work, that maybe there's some lessons to be learned about methods and processes for both gathering, storing, and sharing data for the purposes of evaluation. And yes, number 11 on the list, which is part of 6 and 7, which you've set aside for later, is all about setting up to make sure that the information is collected. So that recommendation does speak to that. I think the point that was made in 9 and 10 is that there's some lack of standardization and in both processes and formats currently for collecting data. And that's not speaking specifically to MRS. Also, there's many other agencies involved in tax expenditures that are collecting information, like the Maine Historic Preservation, the Finance Authority of Maine, DECD, and there's not really any cohesive conversation or coordination about data collection right now. And so those are some of the points that we heard the working group talking about and tried to reflect in these recommendations.
Okay, so we're not writing new legislation to give you more information that is not available to you now. We're just trying to streamline the process. Is that correct?
I would concur that what we heard was there was an interest in some streamlining of the process in terms of getting more information. We also heard that there was an interest in, when establishing new tax expenditures or reviewing ones that are on the books, that the statutes be looked at to make sure that the relevant data points about participants in that, not the tax information, but for instance, historic preservation is an example of one that's well set up now. They collect information on the square footage of the building and the various aspects of the rehabilitation project. Some tax expenditures aren't currently set up to collect that types of data. So there would be, under number 11, as new statutes are developed or current ones are reviewed and amended, there could potentially be additional data, but that's not tax related data that we're speaking to.
Okay, so I guess I still haven't had my question answered. So we're not looking to get more information off of individual or business tax returns. Am I correct in assuming that?
correct. What currently is in statute that OPEGA is authorized to obtain from tax returns would stay as is,
Okay,
was my
Thank you.
understanding.
thank you.
So Pew got us some information yesterday, I believe. And I'm happy to spend time walking through that, but to me, you know, the recommendation number 10, in part of number 9, this is quite a work project, I think, that's going to involve analyzing some examples in other states, talking with MRS and OPEGA about how we might better do this data sharing process, which includes setting up new ways for tax filers to report on the information that they're required to. And so I wonder if this is an item that might get assigned to a potential task force next year that's going to dig into some of these other work projects. Lucia, would you agree this is not a quick fix?
I would concur that this type of work is not a quick fix, that it would be a project. If you proceed to later, if you get to doing some sort of interim task force on certain parts of this process, this would be something that could be specifically given additional attention by that group.
Okay. So for the committee, Representative Millet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And your reference to a task force is the third item in the chair's proposal as an alternate to the subcommittee. That was your reference, I understand?
Correct.
Correct. Thank you.
So I think we've got an understanding that this is not about collecting new confidential info that may be shared with the public. This is really about the method and the way in which the data is inputted and shared. And OPEGA will remain under the confidentiality statutes. So the specific taxpayer info that they may receive, that doesn't go beyond them. It doesn't go to us as lawmakers. So if folks are okay with this, I would say we entertain a motion adopting these 3 recommendations, 9, 10, and 11. And in terms of completing the work, we add this to a potential task force that meets next year to take on the work of implementing. So if that makes sense, I think a motion would be in order. Representative Miller.
So moved as stated by Senator Libby.
I would second that.
Thank you, Representative Stover. Good to see you. We know you're having broadband challenges. We did our best to introduce you earlier this morning, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any further discussion or questions? All in favor? It is, I think, unanimous of those present. Representative Stover, are you a yay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I'm sorry, I thought
Unanimous.
you could see me, but you can't. Yes.
No, it's okay. It freezes on our end.
Can either see you or hear you. It's nice for both.
All right.
It's cranky down here on the coast this morning.
Unanimous of those present. All right, Carrie, number 12 and 13.
Number 12 and 13 both pertain to staff resources. 12 states currently that additional staff resources would be provided to OPEGA with the appropriate number of additional positions to be determined based on the actions taken as a result of this report. And 13 also mentions that depending on how recommendations are implemented, there might be additional staffing needs for taxation or the other methods of implementation that the working group might arrive at, whether that be the subcommittee or a task force.
Thank you, Carrie. Questions or comments on these two items from the committee? Representative Miller?
Just a question, Mr. Chair. Does Lucia have a quantifiable or an estimate of the necessary staffing additions at this point, or when might that recommendation be forthcoming?
I think it's a chicken or the egg kind of answer, but Lucia, go
I
right
would
ahead.
agree. It's a chicken or the egg type question and answer, but clearly this will, if these recommendations go through and are implemented, there are clearly some new responsibilities that would require at least one additional position within OPEGA. I think whether it went beyond that would depend on the extent of what gets ultimately implemented. And I think that will shake out in the process as this goes forward and legislation to implement these particular ones gets worked through the process. There will be the opportunity to figure out exactly what it is and what the fiscal implications are for the office. I would say that, but at least one position seems clear to me at this point.
Thank you, Lucia. So the way I'm thinking about this is a bill that gets submitted to tax, in my opinion, would include one FTE for OPEGA at the outset. And that if that position remains in the bill, that sort of ties the new work to the position, and a bill with an FTE in it is definitely going to be on the table. And and it's the AFA process that's going to ensure it either leaves the AFA table with the work and the new position, or it doesn't leave, or that might get adjusted. So that's how I'm thinking about how this might get developed, and would welcome other thoughts from members.
Makes sense to me, Senator.
Carrie, is this one where we want to maybe wait on a vote till we cover the mechanism section?
I think that makes sense.
Okay, so we'll just put a pin in 12 and 13 for now, and we can move on to 14 and 15.
14 and 15 are a little bit of a different topic, and that's the relationship between the tax expenditure evaluations we've been talking about and the responsibilities that DECD has in terms of evaluations. Number 14 is a suggestion from the working group that 5 MRSA section 130700 could be repealed. And this is the section of statute that refers to DECD's responsibility for analysis of legislation containing economic development proposals. I think it was the opinion of the working group that the work covered now under recommendations 6 and 7 might already cover that work. So that was one recommendation. And then the suggestion under 15 is that the working group amend a different piece of statute which covers independent third-party evaluations to emphasize a different perspective than those that the OPEGA evaluations cover, a more macro, how the expenditures interrelate together to give a bigger picture perspective.
Thank you, Carrie. Questions or comments on this section? Representative Miller.
Just a question, Mr. Chair, to Kara on number 15. Would that be seen as a one-time independent evaluation as opposed to a sequenced regular event going forward?
I would defer to the, oh, it looks like Lucia has something to add on that. So I'll defer to the director.
I just was going to say this is currently in statute as of every 4-year requirement that DECD do this. And what we heard from the working group was that that wouldn't be changed, but that what would be changed would be add a little language to emphasize this macro perspective of looking at the interactions and relationships between the economic incentives. I think it was every 4 years, but Julie may be about to correct me.
No, not to correct you, but I know there was some mention in the last meeting that these provisions are under the jurisdiction of the IDEA committee. And whether you actually want to draft legislation that does these on your own without consulting them, or whether you maybe want to make a recommendation that you think that IDEA ought to look at this and decide whether these changes need to be made. Because it's really sort of outside of the issue of tax expenditure review. It's a parallel process that they have for their purposes, which we may not know those purposes completely. So it's just a comment I wanted to make about that.
Thank you, Julie. So on this one, I get a little uncomfortable with a group like ours going into another committee's policy area that's somewhat outside of our scope, even though it's related. And so my suggestion here is that we include this as a recommendation of the working group in our report, that we transmit the report and maybe a cover letter to the IDEA committee noting this piece as a suggestion, but that we actually do not craft statute and attempt to amend the statute in the tax committee. I think that should be retained by the IDEA committee. Lucia.
I just had one thought, and I think we deliberately, in preparing this chart and the draft, deliberately we're using the word suggestion here as opposed to recommendation. But I think it may have gotten, it's not so obvious, but I think that was a deliberate decision in wording. And I think maybe one way to achieve what I've heard from Senator Libby and that Julie raised would be to say that the working group, suggest that the IDEA committee, assess this. It would be one way to word it, that we suggest that this could be repealed and, refer this to the IDEA committee for its consideration.
I think that's well said.
Yeah.
Representative Miller?
I agree with the suggestion and not getting into the IDEA committee's policy making. I would raise the question again, if this independent third-party evaluation at a macro level were done and done well, whether it needs to be repeated every 4 years. I'm deferring that question to the group in terms of whether you see it as an ongoing need or whether it would satisfy us if IDEA agreed that it be done on a one-time comprehensive macro level.
Thank you. I've got several hands up. Julie, followed by Representative Terry.
I believe that the intention of the 4-year report is to, it's certainly intended to be ongoing, but that it's intended to reevaluate not just whether a provision is working, but also whether there have been changes in the economy or changes in the nature of what businesses may be out there applying for the credit, that it's the kind of thing that needs to be reconsidered every 4 years to see if it's still working, not whether we created a thing that works well and is now going to work well forever. It's recognizing that it needs to be reviewed periodically in order to make sure that things are still working. It also involves things other than tax expenditures. So it includes grant programs and money that may be provided to businesses as part of a bond process for economic development purposes. So it's far beyond the issue of tax expenditures. It includes the state's overall strategy, essentially, which we've come to use in this term for economic development as a whole, not just individual provisions.
Thank you. Representative Terry?
Julie just laid out exactly what I was going to lay out. That again, I think, there's always, the economy changes yearly. forget every 4 years, but it changes on a dime. So I think as it stands right now, I believe it is every 4 years. I wouldn't want to change that. I wouldn't want to change that at all.
Right. So what I'm hearing is there's this statute in place that requires the every 4-year evaluation, and our main point is to communicate to the IDEA committee that as you're considering working with DECD on the next RF or the next study or evaluation, that they give focus to the interaction and relationship among all programs, which is something that is lacking right now, and I think that's the main point. Representative Miller?
Thank you, and thanks to the members who commented, staff included. I just looked at the statute, and I concur with the comments that have been made by Julie and Representative Terry. And I see it in a different light now that I think about it. I had mentioned before, I really believe there is value in the 10-year economic development strategy if maintained and focused on by future legislatures and incoming governors. So that 4-year rotation does kind of tie into an incoming governor and alternate legislative sessions beginning. So I see value in that now, and thanks for the clarity.
Thank you. Further questions or comments? So do we have a motion to approve these 2 recommendations as presented?
I would move them as recommendations, or let me modify that, as suggestions from the working group to the IDEA B committee.
Very good. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Representative Millet, seconded by Senator Pouliot. Further discussion or questions? All in favor? Unanimous of those present. Okay, Carrie, now we are going to move to page 3 of this document. This is the so-called proposed mechanisms table. We've referenced it several times today. So I'll let you go ahead and briefly walk us through this.
Sure. Up until now, we've talked about what the group might be recommending, and now this is a chance to get clear about how those recommendations might be implemented. At the last working group meeting, there was a lot of discussion about a subcommittee. In this table, it's on the left, we're referring to it as a joint advisory committee. And this lays out what that subcommittee might do and what roles it might have. So that's the left-hand column. The right-hand column is an alternate approach that was proposed by the chairs. And it lays out how all of those tasks might be accomplished in a different method. So the subcommittee would consist, and this left-hand column again, would consist of both taxation and GOC members. There was discussion that it would be authorized to meet through the biennium, and that it would do the following: the expedited review of the tax expenditures, review and provide input on the annual categorization and prioritization of tax expenditures, the review of tax expenditures currently assigned for full evaluation to identify which are ready for review, and for those not ready for review to take steps to ensure that they have the needed elements to be evaluated. Number 4, this group would be tasked with prioritizing the schedule for full evaluations, with the emphasis that the group has discussed on economic development programs, and I think the sunset. And number 5, the subcommittee would review OPEGA's full evaluations and then make recommendations to taxation. In the alternate approach, the same work would occur, but in different venues. Expedited review would continue to be something that the taxation committee completed. For number 2, the review and categorization would continue to be taxation and GOC work. For number 3, the review of the tax expenditure slated for review to ensure their readiness, that would be covered by a one-time legislative task force. The chairs had proposed that would include members of both GOC tax and the IDEA committee. For 4, the prioritization work would continue to be tax and GOC. For 5, that again would continue to be GOC and tax work to review OPEGA's full evaluation reports. And we can focus on these for now, but just so you're aware, under either method of implementation, there would be additional responsibilities for both OPEGA and MRS, but we can come back to that later.
Thank you, Carrie. So the comment I would offer on this table is that staff brought to the chairs numerous questions about how to establish this precedent-setting subcommittee. And I noted earlier that in the third meeting of this group, we kind of had this idea of a subcommittee taking on all of the new work. It got clunky and difficult to see how this group would be established, appointed, where it sits. Is it a creature of statute or rule? It was getting a bit unwieldy. So the chairs are offering this alternative, which largely keeps the 2 main committees in play. It incorporates some work from IDEA, and I think we'd say it's perhaps an easier to understand mechanism for accomplishing several tasks we've identified. So with that, I'd look to see if there are questions or comments from members. Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to indicate in the beginning, I appreciate the work of the chairs and staff on framing the proposal on the right-hand column of page 3. I think it is an improvement. And I just have a couple of questions. On the first bullet under the chair's proposal alternative, it talks about GOC membership, including 2 members of tax and 1 member of IDEA. Was that intended to be a reference to increasing the prescription of the 6 House, or no, of the 12 membership with an additional IDA member, or was that just for the mechanism itself?
Great question. I think we were intending that GOC would remain at 12 members, and that among those 12, at least 2 be from tax, 1 be from IDEA, and then an idea that was floated this morning. Sorry, a thought that was floated this morning is ensuring that the 2 tax members come from at least the 2 major parties. Does that clarify does that answer your question?
It does answer on the last point you just made on the 2 members from the tax committee. So we would be prescribing for future majority and minority leaders to appoint members to GOC that would actually stay within 12, but would assure that there'd be a Republican and a Democrat member of tax and a single member of IDEA on the 12-member group. Is that the way you're framing it?
Correct.
Okay. My other question, Mr. Chair, is I like the reference to the one-time task force. It seems to me everything flows in a much more appropriate manner. At the very bottom, the references to OPEGA and MRS, and particularly the discussion we had in the first area, the first topic area about the take-up rate expenditure information. I'm wondering if this is the appropriate time to respond to Dr. Allen's comment about the workload, and I'll just offer my thoughts that I like the word estimated, and I was toying with the idea of suggesting that we add some language to the extent such information may be readily available, rather than implying that we want now to impose on MRS and other agencies to launch activities, unfunded as they may be, to secure additional data that might involve a significant workload. I'll put that in the form of a question, really.
Thank you, Representative. I think that's a good suggestion. My thinking on this when we made the MRS suggestion for take-up rate was that, MRS is able to determine the number of tax households that by income level as a general matter. And I thought as well, they are able to identify the number of tax households that claim a credit. And so it would simply be taking the numerator and the denominator and showing us the percentage of who's claim the credit within a income range. I see that Dr. Allen is still on as a panelist. I'm not sure if he's interested in responding to either my comments or Representative Millett's comments.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate Representative Millett's comments, and I appreciate Representative Terry's earlier comments. And to your question, Senator Libby, in some cases, in some of the credits, that's true that it's part of the analysis, if you will. But I mean, but there are other credits, particularly the Opportunity Main credit, where there just isn't a lot of good data available to us about people that potentially may or may not be eligible for the credit. And so the take-up rate on something like that is extremely difficult. Something like the Property Tax Fairness Credit and the Sales Tax Fairness Credit, the data is not great. There's not a lot of good data on non-filers and people at the low end of the income distribution. And they would clearly be estimates based on other data sets that we try to use.
So on that, let's just focus on the Property Tax Fairness Credit as the working example. Part of what I heard you say is we don't know maybe we don't have the number of people who may be eligible but don't file taxes, and that complicates the estimate.
Correct.
I can see that now. Okay. I think Representative Terry noted maybe this is an item we have as a suggestion, and that through the bill that gets worked by tax in the second regular session, maybe there are some creative solutions outside of the box thinking to how we might task MRS with coming up with some of this data in a way that's relatively low effort. I think everybody agrees this is information we'd like to have. It's just a matter of how we task an agency with collecting it. Are there further thoughts, comments on this item? Okay. How about if we scroll back up to the top, how do folks feel about the right-hand side of the column, the assignment of duties? Carrie?
Sorry, I'm mute button. One thing we hadn't mentioned yet that is in here is that this also discusses tax being authorized to meet year round. So just bringing that to your attention.
Thank you. The idea there is that tax would join the ranks of GOC and appropriations and being able to meet year round to, accept some of those OPEGA reports and perhaps work on a draft piece of legislation in the interim. We were hearing that tax is challenged to do all of their sort of basic duties during a session, and that this might allow for more high quality work to be done at times that makes sense. I like that idea. I think we should recommend that. Are other thoughts? Representative Millet, followed by Representative Kryzak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I totally agree with it. I know there's value in appropriations meeting regularly or as needed during the off-session months, and I can see taxation benefiting similarly, particularly when we get into workload issues that would follow between the first regular and the second, and even up until the election in the second year. So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Representative Kryzak.
I apologize if I missed it. I had to step up for a while. We had talked about making it a requirement of any tax bill would have to be reviewed by the tax committee. Have we included that in this?
Great question. I don't know that we've covered that yet.
Yeah, we have not. I have that in my notes as well. I think that's, I think that actually might be something, Representative Kryzak, that we can do as a committee, especially after doing all of this work, that we can put in legislation over the course of the short session, requiring that very thing. I don't know that that's that it really pertains to the review process. Well, I guess it's sort of, I guess it does. Lucia?
I was just going to note that that's recommendation number 7 at the top of page 2.
Oh, okay, okay.
And maybe it missed, I think it did get missed in creating the table on page 3 of the 2 different columns, but that is in the list under recommendation 7 on top of page 2.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Representative Kryzak, followed by Representative Terry.
Yeah, I just think it's better if we do it this way because tax won't be meeting until January. And then to put in the legislation where now this could be done through this process and it would happen sooner.
Well, we still have to go through the bill process. These are just recommendations, but I see your point for sure. Can I, we haven't gotten back to number 7 yet as far as approving that or not. So perhaps when we get to that, if I might just consider throwing some language in.
Sure. So number 7, I guess when I saw it, I was confused by 2 different tasks that we've identified. One is to have a group go through all of the old credits and ensure they have evaluation parameters. And then the second concept is moving forward, looking ahead. Tax committee is charged with vetting new tax expenditures before they become enacted to ensure that there are adequate evaluation parameters there. Staff gathered some examples for us to consider I think the one that lines up best with what we're hoping to accomplish is the Judiciary Committee's process for evaluating right to know requirements, where I guess I don't want to explain it incorrectly. Maybe I'll ask a staff member who feels ready to give the 30-second overview. Lucia, go ahead.
So the 30-second overview is that whenever there's a legislative proposal to create a new public records exception or change access to records, the bill, when it goes to a policy committee, if there's a majority support for the proposal or an amended version of it, before it can be reported out to the floor, it gets sent over to the Judiciary Committee. And the Judiciary Committee has a list of criteria, which actually the policy committee usually runs through first and preparing to send it over, but sends it over to Judiciary Committee, and they run through a checklist and discuss, and then report back to the policy committee non-binding recommendations about whether it meets the criteria. And so my understanding was to create some type of similar process where there would be, and this is not about, I just want to be clear that our understanding was this was not about the substance of the tax expenditure or the policy, but just clearly is the legislation being set up so that when it comes time to evaluate it, we'll have clarity on the purpose and the intended outcomes and the data being collected to evaluate it.
Well said. So this would assist tax in ensuring that future evaluations have the greatest chance of success. It also, a side benefit, maybe not an intended benefit, but it gives tax members an idea of the tax expenditures that other committees are advocating for. Sometimes that gets missed. I think of transportation and ENR and IDEA, sometimes they come up with tax breaks that they think are great. And at least this will create a process for tax committee to take a look at the evaluation parameters, but the unintended benefit is awareness of other tax credits that are being considered. Julie.
Thank you. One further refinement of that we had sort of been talking about amongst staff as well was whether in that process you want to include every single tax expenditure that might be in the bill, understanding that some of them might be a sales tax exemption with very minimal fiscal impact, or something which will only affect one taxpayer to an extent that it wouldn't ultimately be classified as a full evaluation. So I don't know how we do this exactly, but I had tried to draft something which said that if the provision if a measure legislation in another committee was proposing a tax expenditure which would ultimately be categorized in the full evaluation category, that would be the place at which we would want to have this referral to the taxation committee for that review, similar to what judiciary does with the freedom of access provisions, in order to try to avoid provisions which might be very small and would not ever end up getting a full evaluation anyway. There's some difficulty with that because they don't get categorized as full evaluations until they've actually been enacted. So it would be essentially somebody making a guess as to whether or not they were going to fall into that category. I think is the best we could come up with. Just wanted to mention that.
Is there a way that we could insert an estimated dollar amount as the minimum requirement for triggering the referral? Like if OFPR or MRS gave a non-binding estimate that a new tax break would result in $1 million or more, that be the trigger?
Well, I had thought about using the tax expenditure a breaking line rather than establishing something new. Right now, there's a distinction between full review and expedited review based upon essentially whether they're established for particular purposes or for a broad overall tax policy for expedited review. The line between those two categories and the no review is $50,000. So that would be that line. On the other hand, I mean, Lucia needs to weigh in on this, I think, that whether in looking at legislation, it would be possible for OPEGA to maybe look at it and go, yeah, that's, ultimately it's going to go through the process of them making recommendations to GOC and GOC making a decision. But they're probably in a position in looking at legislation to make a pretty good guess as to whether or not it would go into full or expedited review. But that's Lucia's area, not mine. So she needs to weigh in on that.
I can just offer that, that's an exercise that OPEGA does every year after legislation is enacted or amending existing tax expenditures. So it is something that we're familiar with doing and referring back to the statutes. As Julie noted, full evaluations are for tax expenditures intended to provide an incentive for specific behavior or benefit a specific group of taxpayers, or for where there's measurable goals that can be identified. And then there's the break to the expedited review, which is the broad tax policy goals that cannot be reasonably measured. And then the $50,000 break for no review. So we are familiar with doing that. I think if it was that, we could be consulted in the process, as the committee was, I don't know whether that's in the policy committee when they're determining, does this need to go over to taxation, or policy committee send them over to taxation, and then taxation committee says, okay, we've gotten these from the various policy committees. Which ones do we need to consult with OPEGA on? Which ones need to be set up for full evaluation? I think these are some logistical details that would still need to be worked out.
So we had talked about a tax committee review before enactment, but since OPEGA already does an annual review of new tax expenditures, I wonder if we might reconfigure this a bit so that the tax review is triggered after OPEGA completes their regular annual review. So that might make it simpler. Lucia?
I just want to make sure I understand. So if something gets enacted, then there would be a requirement that in the next session, the taxation committee review and against these criteria. And if they haven't been met, submit a bill to ensure. So it would put it through two steps of, I'm just trying to clarify the process. If something gets enacted, then it gets reviewed and legislation is submitted if necessary to ensure that those are met. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay.
Representative President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we should review it before it becomes legislation rather than have it become law and then have OPEGA look at it and then have us look at it later. I think the tax committee should see it before it becomes legislation.
I agree. I'd like that to be the process. I guess I'm getting hung up with the logistics of how you decide which bills trigger this tax review, because if transportation creates a $10,000 exemption for 5 people, do we want tax to establish evaluation parameters for that one, knowing that it's probably not going to be subject to a full evaluation? That's one example of a hang up I'm seeing with this. Where's the cutoff, I guess? How do we decide which bills need to go to tax for this review and which don't. Representative Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I kind of tend to think that they all should. It's pretty rare that a tax bill gets to another committee. I think that, in the process, most of the time, we see the bulk of the work. Obviously, we see the bulk of the work. But I think that with our area of expertise, AKA Julie, being able to analyze something sort of, even if it's just on the fly, to see whether or not it's going to sort of fit within the law, that within existing law. I sort of think that it would be smart, even if there is no evaluation necessary for it to come through us. So we're creating product that's consistent across the board, rather than having these things that come up that are inconsistent with most other tax laws. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So let me throw out something based on that. So what if every new tax credit devised by a committee must be referred to tax, and tax is the decision maker on whether something needs to have evaluation parameters established, or in tax reviewing the proposal, you say, well, this is going to be small potatoes, let's just let this one go. That might be rather than creating a trigger or something like that, maybe that would be a simpler process.
I feel comfortable with that. I would be interested if Representative Kryzak and Senator Pouliot would be comfortable with that as well.
I would be.
Fine.
Lucia?
I was just gonna say, and the current practice has been that the tax committee has sought input or advice from OPEGA, on these matters, and that could just continue as current practice. And so that this would just be that any tax credit, whether it goes, what I'm hearing now is whether it comes through directly through the taxation committee or through another policy committee, would get vetted. Is this likely to require evaluation? And if so, does it meet these things? And then, and if you wanted to consult with OPEGA, if it's sort of muddy as to whether this would qualify, we could be available as we have been.
Great.
Sounds like we're building consensus around that last concept, which is any bill coming out of a committee that creates a new tax expenditure goes to tax for a review of evaluation parameters, and OPEGA is available to consult as needed. Seeing head nods. Okay. For staff, is that clear as we've stated it?
Clear for me. Thank you.
So we have stated what we're hoping to achieve in recommendation number 7. I think a motion's in order.
Sorry, Senator, did we do 6 first? Or are we doing them together, that is?
While it's fresh in our minds, I'm suggesting we do 7.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay.
I think Representative Millett looked like he was about to speak.
But I will need help from the group in making sure we cover the ones I've skipped over also. So number 7 is what I'm asking for a motion for at the moment.
Mr. Chair,
Representative
I would move that the working group endorse item number 7 under the topic of newly enacted or amended expenditures can be evaluated in the manner discussed.
Thank
I'll
you,
second
Representative Millett. Seconded by Representative Kryzak. Further comments or questions? All in favor? Unanimous of those present. Representative Terry, you noted number 6. We still have to take a vote on, I believe. I'm seeing Carrie nod her head yes. So number 6. All right, so we just took care of the forward-looking piece, and now number 6 is looking backwards in time. So I think number 6, one idea I had is that this project be tasked with I forget what we're calling it, but a study commission for next year, and this would be added to the list, or maybe it's included in the list under mechanisms.
It is.
Okay. Questions or comments on that one? Representative Krajicek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're looking at going forward with tax expenditures that are already enacted. We're not looking to go back to the people that have been using these tax expenditures up to now. We're looking forward to anybody that applies for these in the future will have new requirements, and the others would be grandfathered. Am I correct?
I think what we're talking about here is looking at all of the tax expenditures that are in place today, going through the statute to see if adequate evaluation parameters are articulated.
Okay.
I don't know, and I'd look to staff, if we create an evaluation parameter for an existing credit, is that going to somehow impact the day-to-day of a tax expenditure beneficiary? I think Representative Krajicek is trying to ensure we're not creating new burdens for existing beneficiaries.
Right.
Representative Terry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we did have this discussion and FAME and DECD helped us along with this, that most of the time, there is a yearly process of applying for some of these credits, and some of them are years in the making. So I think once we go through all of these, we'll find spots where it would be appropriate for us to add them to the yearly application, and then spots where we'll probably miss out on some information coming in because a program application lasts for 5 years, let's just say. I'm comfortable with sort of, because this is a long-term project, letting that kind of stuff go. But I think that will happen with this working group. We'll be able to make those determinations on what's going to be appropriate to go forward quickly and what's going to be a step process maybe for some of these folks that are taking advantage of these programs. But I think that's going to be the meat of the work of the task force, not so much what we're doing here, but again, going forward, when we get to that part of this, we'll need to sort of look at things individually, which is what we're going to be doing anyway with each of the statutes. So.
Krajicek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify, you're saying that we will add these to these tax expenditures. So if somebody has to renew every year or is applying because their 5 years or 10 years is up, they will have to meet the new requirements, but we're not going back in history and telling them that they have to give us this information for, say they've been on it for 5 years, you have to give us this information for the last 5 years. Am I correct in that, Madam Chair?
That would not be my recommendation to go back and have them redo stuff. I would not want to do that to the business community. I would want them going forward to know what was expected of them, but certainly not going backwards. And no. Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, your assumption is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Further questions or comments? Okay, do we have a motion on number 6? Don't be bashful. Representative Millet.
I would move that the working group endorse the recommendation in item number 6 under the topic of preparing existing expenditures for future evaluation in sync with the previously consensus established on the new mechanism going forward.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Motion made by Representative Millet, seconded by Representative Krajzak. Further comments or questions? All in favor? It's unanimous of those present. Okay. Could we get some help with which other items are? Yes, Carrie, go ahead.
I believe the final two, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, are the staff resources recommendations. And I wondered if you wanted to return to the mechanisms table to see what's laid out for OPEGA and MRS and the taxation committee here before returning to those.
Yep, I think if you can just hold on the screen here for a moment.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
We want to look at 12 and 13, which deal with staff resources at OPEGA. And number 13 speaks to additional staffing needs for taxation committee. Julie, based on the consensus so far, do you feel we need to have discussion about additional taxation committee staff resources, or is that adequately covered by our discussion of potentially one FTE at OPEGA?
Well, it's still a little hard to predict. I mean, I think that a lot may depend upon how this process of review of legislation submitted, new legislation submitted that proposes a tax expenditure, how that turns out. And it's hard for me to sort of estimate how much work that will be for the taxation committee. And the other thing is with regard to the work of, if you end up going the route of the alternative approach, then there are things that tax would continue to be doing, which would continue to need to be staffed, but that's something that's currently ongoing right now. I was sort of, I was the one that sort of suggested the language be put in there about taxation committee staffing, just not being clear at this point whether staffing would be required. If you want to take it out, then you could take it out. We could always deal with it later. Or I was thinking of it just sort of be a statement in the report that says, we don't really know exactly what the impact is yet. If this is going to be on the taxation committee, it's going to be authorized to have a lot more meetings off session. We don't really know what that's going to look like yet. That may be something we need to think about in the future. We really don't know that answer right now. Something like that makes sense to me, but it's your call.
Yep. Thank you, Julie. Just before Carrie goes, just I'd like whatever our motion is to incorporate what Julie just said with respect to taxation committee staffing, and that is that we don't know what that might look like now. It depends on outcomes later on. And then I'd also like us to speak to the OPEGA staffing piece, which right now is at least one FTE if all of the recommendations are enacted. So that's not really spelled out in 12 or 13 as written, but that's kind of what I'm hearing. So Carrie, go ahead.
I was wondering if it would be helpful to return back to the mechanisms. It's been raised to me that I don't think there have been full decisions about all of where the pieces would lie, and that might help us to see where
Sure.
staffing needs might be.
Lucia, followed by Representative Kryzak.
I just wanted to add, as you head back there, that I think this legislative task force, the interim study to review all of the current, the 23 or 30 tax expenditure existing statutes and do that work. And then also there was some discussion earlier today about sending another piece of work on the data sharing and data standardization to that task force that potentially absorbing that's potentially a lot of work, which is necessary and important work, it sounds like, for the task force, and we'd want to see it done. I just wondering about the staffing resources to sufficiently support that task force coming from, you know, where those would come from, whether they were OPEGA or OFPR, and can that be absorbed within existing resources? It seems like it might be more work beyond what, for instance, was done, you know, with this 4-meeting task force. So I just wanted to flag that.
That's a good flag. I think for our project today, we should talk about the work. Our best guess on the OPEGA side, what the staffing might require. On the tax side, a strong suggestion that we don't know if more staff support is needed, and that once we get into the spring of next year, where a bill is being worked, we can have, I think, more time to figure out this piece. And then there are also other mechanisms to achieve some of the work, like the tax data sharing piece. That could be a resolve directing agencies to develop recommendations and have them due back, to a subsequent legislature. That's one idea, and there are probably others. But I think I hear your point that could be a large task. Sorry, Representative Kryzak, you had your hand up.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. How does government oversight and appropriations do it now? I mean, we have staff in taxation that are only there during session. Now taxation is going to be going year round. How do you do with your staff? Does your staff work year round?
I'm going to see if Julie wants to clarify.
Yes, hi, I am here year round.
Well, I know you. I know you are, but
yes, well, OPEGA is kind of a unique entity because it is set up to do particular things in statute and to serve one particular committee, and they are authorized by statute to meet whenever they need to. The Government Oversight Committee is. The Appropriations Committee also has language which permits them to meet whenever they want to. That committee is staffed by OFPR, and although it has one primary analyst assigned to it, all of the analysts within OFPR also respond to the needs of the Appropriations Committee as necessary. We all also obviously have other tasks than staffing either tax or Appropriations Committee, which we do as well. So mostly during the interim, because during the session, the work is ongoing. And of course, for Appropriations Committee, they generally have monthly meetings like the Government Oversight Committee as a general rule, but sometimes that becomes more frequent, sometimes becomes less frequent, depends upon any individual session's needs. Have I answered your question?
no, I was looking at, how we're staffed now. We have you and then we have one other person that works during the legislative period. And then, doesn't work the rest of the year. So since the tax committee is going to be working year round, would that person now become a year round person rather than just during our committee time? I mean, our legislative time.
The only person who works for the taxation committee who's only here part of the year is the committee clerk.
Right. So that's what I was wondering. If that's what you were asking, whether the committee clerk would work year round now, and that would,
Oh, I
answer your
see. Thank
question.
you. Now I understand.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. The Government Oversight Committee, Sabrina, I believe, serves as the clerk for that committee. And in OFPR, we have a position which serves part-time secretarial duties within the office, but is also the committee clerk for the Appropriations Committee. The person who has been doing that for many years now has just retired, and we were advertising for a new person. That position has typically been full-time during the legislative session and part-time when the legislature is not in session. But that person also has administrative secretarial duties within OFPR, in addition to just being the clerk for the Appropriations Committee. So there is other work than clerk work that is assigned to that person in OFPR anyway. I'm sure in OPEGA, there's a lot of things that Sabrina does in addition, I'm sure, in addition to being the clerk for the Government Oversight Committee.
So Representative Krajak, I'll share that I don't know that I would recommend creating a full-time tax committee clerk as part of this work, because I could see tax meeting 2 or 3 times a year tops in the off season. If I had to guess, clerk duties could be assumed by the AFA clerk for those 2 or 3 occasions.
Okay.
I think we would probably need to talk with OFPR about that, but in terms of a recommendation, I'd say we stay silent on the clerk piece, and if it becomes problematic, we can talk through that then.
Okay. I didn't know how often we were going to be meeting now that we're going full year round. That's why, I was, and Julie had brought up the idea of, more staffing for tax. So I just thought that would be the appropriate thing to do, to have somebody that works with us throughout the session, just to continue to work with us the rest of the year.
Right.
But I guess we'll find that out after it isn't enacted.
Well, hopefully we'll flesh it out more before enactment, but Julie, if tax were to meet, tomorrow, the tax clerk who'd been here for the session is not going to come staff that committee tomorrow. It would, somebody from OFPR or OPLA would fill in, I would expect, right?
No one from OPLA would fill in. No, it's if the taxation committee chooses to meet during the interim. There used to be a process where the committee could request from the Legislative Information Office that they provide a clerk, and they used to have a clerk or 2 that were sort of on staff year round to be able to fill that purpose. But in the last couple of years, that has not been available. If the taxation committee were to meet, for instance, next week, then we would probably have somebody, we may have somebody come down and serve as clerk or as the analyst who would be there. I may do that. If you're meeting online, everything's so weird right now with committee meetings. If you're having a Zoom meeting, then the one secretary that we have in OFPR, because we've got the one vacant position that we're trying to refill. Actually, we've refilled it, but she hasn't started yet. She's starting on the 15th. Her name is Judith Hannum, and she's going to be the clerk for the Appropriations Committee. Anyway, we would try to meet that clerk need from OFPR as best we could during the session. And if there's no body who does it, I do the best I can to do both jobs.
And you do amazing.
I talk too much.
No.
Representative Terry, as chair of tax, do you want to weigh in on this question?
I think we're getting into the meat of stuff that will follow into the bill work that we do, the legislative work that we do once we set our recommendations. And I think it's my experience that the staff, if there's something that legislators want or need, the staff will do anything and everything that they can to make it happen for us. So I think that we are a lucky bunch as far as that kind of stuff goes. So I think that, again, I think we're diving into the meat of stuff that we'll see once these bills come to us, or single bill, however it pans out. So yeah, I'm comfortable going in as is and waiting to do that work when the time comes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we are still looking at the table. I'm interested in trying to advance a consensus recommendation around the chair's alternative approach. I believe we've added one task to the list, which is potentially the data sharing project. Carrie?
I think the recommendations 9 and 10 around data we discussed being added to item 3 here. And then something that was missing that you all captured, I think recommendation 7 will be added to the list as discussed previously.
Right.
Lucia?
I just want to get clarification. Did you vote on 12 and 13?
No.
Okay. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. And then I had also heard, with respect to what Carrie just mentioned about recommendations 9 and 10 potentially coming under the task force, I also just heard Senator Libby say potentially 9 and 10 could also be directed to agencies. So maybe we just stay sort of flexible on, in the language of 9 and 10, that there's possible avenues and that's something that gets worked out further down the line. And that the items that I would see in the chart on page 3, the 2 proposals that are not, that would need to be, I guess, voted on would be the change in the membership of the GOC and the authorization of tax meeting year round, but that the rest are captured in other recommendations or are not changes to current practice.
I think those are all fair statements. Okay, so I think for clarity for staff, a motion adopting the alternative approach with the edits that have been articulated in our discussion would be in order. Representative Millett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that the working group recommend putting forward the chair's proposal on an alternative approach as listed in the right-hand column of page 3 of our working document, and that we utilize, if needed, the boilerplate language on staff assistance that was included in this working group's assignment to support the item 3 within that group, within that proposal. And I think that would be where I would see us going on the mechanism. To Lucia's question on item 12, I think that's a separate motion and you've referred to it, Mr. Chair, but I think it probably warrants an affirmative motion as well. But I would submit my motion on the chair's proposal with that alternative language, which for everybody's benefit just says staff assistance, the Legislative Council shall provide necessary staffing services to the working group, in this case, the task force, except that the Legislative Council staff support is not authorized when the legislature is in regular or special session. I would think that would cover any staffing needed for the legislative task force, and it fits neatly within that chair's proposal.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Representative Millet, for the motion. It's been seconded by Representative Kryzak. First to staff, any questions on the motion? Okay, we're good? Okay. To the working group, any comments or questions? We're going to try to wrap up by 11:55 with our votes for Senator Pouliot. So all in favor? It's unanimous of those present. I believe we need to take a vote on a final item, which is 12 and 13.
Would it be helpful to look at the changes laid out below, or helpful to go back to the language of the recommendations?
Oh, okay. I think we can take a vote on these two items. We've covered them earlier in the morning, but if staff would like the clarity, we can certainly take a vote on that one. No, all set? Okay. Item 12 and 13 has to do with staffing. So I think what I've heard so far is at least one FTE would be required, but potentially more for the OPEGA responsibilities, and additional taxation committee staffing needs are to be determined based on legislation this group recommends and decisions that will be made later. So that messy sentence I'm making in the form of a motion. Or no, I would ask for a motion like that.
So moved.
Moved by Representative Kryzak,
Second.
second by Representative Terry. Questions or comments? All in favor? It's unanimous of those present. Carrie, do we have anything left that we need to take a vote on?
I believe you've covered it all. Julie, did you catch anything else? I think
Julie,
we're
you're
good.
on mute. Julie, if you're talking to us, you're on mute.
Sorry. I always get confused with that thing, the little box in my picture that either says mute or unmute. And I'm not sure whether it's telling, the box is telling me what I am. Like right now it says mute. So I think that means that I'm mute, as opposed to meaning that it will take the action of muting. So yeah, I was looking through my notes real quick here, and I think that I'm all set. Yeah, I think we've covered everything.
Lucia, is there anything on your list that we've left outstanding?
I think it's all set. I think the only last thing would be clarity or direction on getting from here to submission of the final report.
Right, that's certainly important. I think maybe it was Julie articulated earlier in the session that we are not authorized to meet again. So the completion of the report is going to be led by the staff. If there are subsequent questions or clarity that the staff require, chairs in the past have helped facilitate that. I think that would be helpful to the staff if this group wants to take a vote authorizing the chairs to sort of mediate and facilitate that piece. Lucia?
In my past experience in other context staffing interim studies, there's been sort of a range in terms of how far the report goes in terms of draft legislation. So I just want to get clarity because I've experienced different degrees of that in legislative study commissions that I've staffed before when I worked at OPLA. So some of these recommendations clearly have implications for statutory changes. Some it sounded like perhaps that's to be developed. I just want to be, just clear what the expectations are. I think that the joint order did say the report including draft legislation. So if there is any expectations, I'd just be helpful to know what they are as we move to the next step.
Right. I think I would say that given the complexity of what we are recommending, that tasking staff to develop a bill by December 1st might be a lift given the holidays. So an alternative would be that, I'm willing to submit a bill title to Legislative Council. I'd welcome the 7 members as the co-sponsors, and we can work through December and January together on a draft that will get submitted to tax. I think that will make the workload a little lighter for the staff and will help us take some action on the recommendations we've developed. So that would be my proposal.
I agree with that 100%.
Okay. Folks good with that? Okay.
Great.
All right, so do we need to take any other votes, or do we have clear enough direction for staff?
You guys are clear?
I think it's,
Unmute.
I think it's
Um,
clear. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Julie.
It just seemed to me like there needed to be one more step with regard to staff completing the report with being facilitated through the chairs. I think once we've got to where all, staff and chairs are okay with it, we send it out to the working group members for
Okay.
their review before December 1st, and it actually becomes completely final. Is that part of what you were envisioning as well?
Sure. If there's a motion to authorize the chairs to work with staff on producing the final report for your review, that would be in order.
So moved.
Moved by Representative Kryzak,
Second?
seconded by Representative Millet. Discussion? All in favor? It's unanimous of those present. Representative Pouliot, we've got 3 minutes to spare. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Great job.
Good. Thanks everyone for digging into these challenging topics. I think we've done some good work. I'm excited to take the next step with everyone and try to see some of these changes enacted. So I really appreciate everyone's attention and effort, time spent on this.
I echo that and thank you all for the future work of the Taxation Committee. having recommended some of these changes, we will we'll keep you all posted.
Final comments?
Thank you all. And if there's anything I can do to help you with the bill, let me know.
Appreciate that, Representative. Motion to adjourn is in order.
Second.
Made by Representative Terry, seconded by Representative Kryzak. All in favor? Great. Have a great weekend.
Everyone.
See you on the task force.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.